My involvement with Carrie dates back 40 plus years, which I have a lot of trouble getting my head around because I still think of myself basically as the kid in his young 20s who came to New York intending to be a film critic and a theater critic. So I came back from lunch one rainy afternoon to find a little slim, unprepossessing manuscript, about 200 pages, sitting and waiting for me to be read immediately on my desk. And again, it was by a high school English teacher. There's a theme here. And this was, of course, by Stephen King and was called Carrie. I sat down with no expectations in particular to read it. And in the first dozen pages, King had laid out an incredible collage of three things sort of in a row that got my attention. The first was an incident when Carrie was 3 and there was a rain of stones that was reported in the newspaper, and this sort of weird weather phenomenon that had occurred. Second was cutting to Carrie in high school in the shower, having her first period. And in response, the girls, like Lord of the Flies, female style, viciously attacked her, and a light bulb exploded. And that got my attention even more. And the third piece was Carrie going home from this high school hell that she was in, only for us to find out that she had a religious zealot, fanatic mother who made high school look like a day at the beach. And 12, 15 pages in, it was clear to me, not only was this astonishing as a first novel that was beyond assured and confident and ambitious and challenging, this was the real deal, and this guy was it. He put his finger on a lot of things, from Carrie, who was the sort of poster child for bullying. There were elements of the supernatural, there were elements of science fiction, and so on. And what kept one reading were not only turning the pages was what happens next, which was a major part of the storytelling, but the belief in these characters and how real they were and how identifiable, that this was a writer who could remember what it was like from the inside out of being a teenager, rather than most writers who write from the outside in. He was completely in touch with that inner self. I finished the book in one reading, breathless at that point with excitement, and quickly typed up my coverage for it, turned it in, and ranted and raved to anyone within hearing distance that we had to do this movie, that this book was an astonishing first novel and it would make a fantastic film. Mr. Susskind, who was not all that keen on doing a much softer piece of material like Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, looked at me as if I were certifiable and not a unique expression as I would come to find. I was also freelancing for a bunch of other studios and raved to Warner Brothers, other places, that they had to do this. Long and short, no takers whatsoever. I think the period scene got that same strange look from predominantly male executives, and there wasn't a chance they were going to go there and do that. And even when the book sold to paperback, the rights for paperback sold for $400,000, there were no takers. Cut to, I went off to Arizona to production executive Alice. I read along the way that someone in Hollywood had optioned the rights to the book, and I went, well, that's that. Finished Alice, moved to LA, was again looking for a job and a way to pay the rent, and was being offered a lot of jobs working for producers or studios, none of which I had a great desire to do. A mutual friend called me and said, there's this guy at Fox who's just made a huge deal there, and you've got to meet him. And I went, no, not interested in another producer. And he went, this is a different thing. This guy produced Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. He produced Slaughterhouse-Five. He was the guy who brought Peyton Place to nighttime television and broke every rule about how you do soaps on TV at night. And it'll be worth your meeting him. I went to the meeting. His name was Paul Monash. He expressed all of the projects that he had in development, none of which interested me remotely. I said, thank you very much, shook hands, walked down the hall, And he called out from his office, Larry, wait a minute. I forgot to mention one other little project you've probably never heard of. I have this little book called Carrie. And I stopped bolt dead in the walk, turned around, went back and took the job. So that was really the beginning. Paul had already commissioned, when I came aboard, another script by another writer. It arrived, it was a disaster. It wasn't a particularly faithful adaptation of the book, nor was it particularly good. And the option on the book was about to come due. We had no script to turn into 20th Century Fox, and he was in a panic, looked at me and said, what do we do? And being in my early 20s and having zero fear and a lot of confidence and thinking I really knew this piece, I said, let me go home for 4 or 5 weeks and I'll write a script, and you'll have a good script that we can turn in. And he looked at me and was desperate at not having much else in the way of an option and said, do you think you know how to do this? And I went, uh-huh. And he said, great. And off I went and returned that many weeks later with a first draft of the screenplay. He loved it. It got turned into Fox on a Friday to the executives for what they call weekend read, which is their convention of how they don't read scripts normally during the week. And we expected to hear in a week, 2 weeks. There's never any quick turnaround in those kind of things. And on Monday morning, they called and said they had no interest in the piece. They didn't like it, and the project was in turnaround. And just like that, we went from a movie in development to a project with no home. Good piece of news, and the twist in the story is that a woman named Marcia Nassiter, who had been the agent for the book in Los Angeles and had sold it to Monash, had left her job and become one of the first female VPs at United Artists. The second we were in turnaround, she called Paul and said, we'll make the movie. And we went from no deal to an active development deal at United Artists, albeit with their reservation that it had to be made at a budget as the sort of lower double bill half of a horror bill. We were off and running. So that's sort of where it began. The book posed some interesting challenges because of the way Steve had written it, because it was originally written as a short story to sell to a magazine like Cavalier that had been fished out of the wastebasket when he got depressed about doing it and discouraged, and that his wife pulled out and saved. It got to be longer than a short story, but not long enough to be a novel. So it fell in some weird middle place. He created what one calls an epistolary structure. And that meant it was a collage of lots of different elements, ranging from a commission that had been convened by the governor of the state to investigate the tragedy of prom night, to flashbacks, to magazine articles, to scientists arguing about the existence of something called telekinesis, and so on. So he filled the book up in order to give it novel-like length. So the first thing that I did in approaching the adaptation was to jettison virtually all of that, because as interesting as it was literary and not particularly filmic as an approach. There were two things that I chose to keep when I began to work on the script, and they lasted in there for a fair amount of time. The first was a flashback that is really connected to that little newspaper bit that occurs maybe 40 pages into the book, and it's this rain of stones that occurs when Carrie is 3 years old. The interesting thing about it was that it served, I thought, as a perfect little prologue for the movie, and I scripted it as such. And it was from that bizarre, arresting kind of opening beginning that we would cut to Carrie in the volleyball game. Secondly, I liked very much the idea that Sue, who was the moral conscience and sort of center and survivor of this story, would in fact have a role throughout the movie, and that one could tease that idea with her appearances before the White Commission. So they were interwoven through the piece in the first draft. That was it. I jettisoned and let go of everything else. When De Palma came aboard, he had about 4 things that he wanted to do. He was incredibly enthusiastic and generous about the script. He wanted to remove any elements of the White Commission and really go back to just the core story and not have it interrupted at any point along the way. He did, however, love the prologue, and that remained through the production until the end. So that was sort of the first level of the approach. The other thing is, because books and film are really different forms and different mediums with their own needs and rules and storytelling challenges, there were a lot of things that weren't in the book that became whole cloth inventions. They were what I like to call the illusion of fidelity, which is that they're whole cloth created scenes, but they're as if I've put on my Steve King writing cap, and if he had thought of it, he would have written that, because it enlarges this character, because it creates another piece that's not in the book being the book. So there were probably a dozen of those. There's nothing in the book where Margaret, as her proselytizing evangelical self, goes door to door and goes to the Snell house and meets Sue's mother. That scene didn't exist. Tommy doesn't come to Carrie's house to ask her to the prom. He asks her at school. Carrie doesn't tell her mother in the book that she's been invited to prom and have that major showdown in which she shuts the windows as a sign of power. I could go on. It was an interesting process. While I was working for Monash and while the script was in development, Brian had read the book and was completely taken with it, and I think saw the opportunity it presented for him as a filmmaker. So he got his agent to phone up Monash and ask for a meeting. Monash, who didn't know him really at all and had heard of him as somebody who had done sort of independent, low-budget comedies, wasn't really interested. The agent pushed, and he said, fine, I'll take the meeting. So we sat down with Brian. Brian, who is many things, was a terrible interview and chose not to pitch at all. He sort of sat there. He was very terse. Monash, who came from the best of the Hollywood veteran kind of school, was used to being schmoozed and given all the reasons that I have to do this movie. Brian provided zip. So the meeting was over. Paul looked at me and shrugged and said, what do you think about him? And I said, I think he's very talented. I have some worries about him for this piece of material because it is not comedic in the way that he's comedic. And it needs someone who's got a whole lot of style and, most of all, emotion to make this piece land. And Paul said, who do you think we should be going after? And I said, like Roman Polanski. And I was thinking, dream big. Ken Russell, even, to go further out on the insane limb. But we thought that was that. When we went into turnaround and we ended up at United Artists, Brian's agent pressed the head of production there, who was a fan of Brian's, for him to direct the movie. And he called Monash, the head of production called Monash and said, De Palma's a good candidate for this. Paul still wasn't particularly impressed, but wise to the ways of Hollywood and politics, understood this was how they wanted to make the movie, and we were a go if he said yes. Simultaneously, Brian had just finished directing and editing his first real studio, larger budget, big deal movie. And it was a thriller called Obsession. It was shot masterfully by Vilmos Zsigmond. It was scored by Bernard Herrmann. It was with Jean-Pierre Bugeaud and Cliff Robertson. And it was, I ended up getting him to screen the movie for me. I went by myself, saw it, and looked at it and went, whatever else, this is the best damn demo for what he can do with Carrie. I see everything in this that's going to make it work, and we should be happy to have him. That all went smoothly. Brian came aboard, and he and I sat down at his apartment that he was staying at on Fountain Avenue in LA in Hollywood, and he was, somewhat to my surprise, incredibly generous about the script. He loved it, saw everything he wanted to do with it, and had very few things he wanted me to accomplish in a rewrite. The first of those, as I've said, was to really take out all of the Sue material with the White Commission, and he felt that was unnecessary and would get in the way. Second, he told me that he wanted to hire Betty Buckley to play the gym teacher. I knew her from New York theater. I had seen her first audition in New York and her audition for the musical of Follies, and I was a big fan. And I went, great. He said, what I want you to do is enlarge this part and give her more to do in more layers. It's a terrific role, and I think she'll play the hell out of it. And I went, great. And that was how a whole slew of scenes that hadn't been in the book ended up being created for the film, for Betty, basically. He had several other reservations that he thought we could do better. One was that he thought that Carrie's means of killing Margaret in the book, in which she stops her heart with her mind, wouldn't translate to film at all, that we needed something highly visceral. The other was literary from his perspective, and we needed something active that he could really shoot. And we worked on that for a bunch. Perhaps a month or two in, I was having dinner out one night in LA with Scorsese, and Brian came into the restaurant and came running over to the table and said, I've got it. And he proceeded to describe Carrie sending a fuselage of kitchen utensils and skewering Margaret. And I sort of looked at him and thought, this is like borderline very funny. I mean, she could end up looking like a porcupine. So he directed me to take a look at one of Kurosawa's masterpieces, Throne of Blood, in which Toshiro Mifune is attacked by soldiers with bows and arrows. And I looked at this and went, got it. I mean, it's one of those moments that you have to understand the source to get the result. And so that was a go. Lastly, he was concerned that we needed a real killer of an ending for the movie. And the ending in the book is what Steve created was a sort of ... across the country somewhere. There's a mother writing to her sister about a child who's doing strange things. And the sense was there's another Carrie out there. And that was thoroughly legitimate, but entirely predictable. So we worked on a number of endings at that point. Throughout the endings, I think that I wrote, there was always the cross with Carrie White burns in hell featured in some way. And there was one ending with Sue, who is in a sanitarium having had a mental breakdown. We still didn't have an ending. Very late into the shooting, Brian came over to me one day and said, okay, I think I've got it. And I said, okay. And he had me sit down in a chair, and he beat by beat told me how the scene would work, with Sue coming with the bouquet of flowers, leaning down. And just at the moment he described the hand coming out of the grave, he grabbed my knee, and I let out a yelp. And I knew immediately that was how it was going to work, because he could shoot it and he understood it. And it was also clear to me it was a really great sort of borrowing of the end of Deliverance, with the hand coming up out of the water in Jon Voight's Nightmare. And I thought, this is brilliant. But if it would work for me sitting there, it was certainly going to work. And it was going to be interesting to see how hundreds of people would respond to that moment. So those were really the key things. He added a great deal to the movie, which was fantastic, meaning that because of his background in comedy and improvisation, he understood that the tone of the movie was a very tricky tone, and that it was so heavy and so over the top at certain moments that it needed to be balanced with comedic elements as well. So as a result, the Travolta character, who in the novel Billy is a thug, and a mean thug at that, became much more of a goofus, hilarious character. And his and Nancy Allen's chemistry was really funny while they were doing really horrible things. So that was a whole sort of added layer to the script that I thought was inspiration and really made the film kick. I think the most challenging thing about making Carrie it was twofold. It was first agreeing on a budget with United Artists, which there was a couple $100,000 in the difference, and they wouldn't give, and De Palma wouldn't give. And ultimately, Brian was packing up his offices ready to walk, and realized I'm experienced. I know what this film is going to cost making it. It's going to cost what I think it costs. But let me just say yes to it. And then later we'll deal with that problem. And that's precisely what ended up happening. The second was getting the studio to take it seriously as something other than the lower double half of a horror bill, that it was a movie that ultimately ended up with both Sissy and Piper getting Academy Award nominations, a rarity in the horror movie side of the Academy Awards. And both gave incredible tour de force performances. I think UA, I thought at some point, when did I know the movie was going to be a hit? And the answer was, one, when I watched Sissy and Piper rehearsing and then shooting, and I looked at these 5, 6, 7-minute scenes between them, which was very unusual for a movie where it's usually 2 minutes if it's that much. And it was like watching a master class in acting, like Anne Bancroft and Patty Duke in The Miracle Worker. And I went, that's fantastic. I knew when we sneak previewed the movie on Halloween Eve on Hollywood Boulevard and around the country, and they promoted it heavily as a horror movie. It's far more complicated than simply being a horror movie as a genre. But in any event, at the very end, my partner and I went to see the movie on Hollywood Boulevard, where it was the midnight screening after Sparkle, a sort of pre-Dreamgirls movie with Irene Cara. And the audience was 99% African American who'd come out to see Sparkle. And they were an incredible audience. They were rapt at attention. They talked to the screen. They were completely engaged with it. At the moment, right at the very end, when Mrs. Snell is talking to her friend on the telephone and said, the doctor says she's going to be all right, a guy in the balcony stood up and yelled at the top of his lungs, "That girl ain't never going to be right again." And the entire audience laughed like crazy. And 30 seconds later, the hand came up out of the grave, and they screamed their brains out, lost their popcorn, and then they laughed again, having been scared like kids. And I looked at it at that moment, and I knew it was going to be a huge success. How huge? No one knew. The other thing was that we had done a friends and family screening at MGM before the movie came out, and Brian invited Steven Spielberg to come to the screening, and he came over afterwards and said, 32 million. And that was his prognosis of this little movie that had cost, $1.8 million. And I sort of took his word for the fact that we were okay. So Carrie as a musical came about one night when Michael Gore, the composer, and I had gone to see a production of Lulu, an opera by Alban Berg at the Met. And it was for a 1930s opera, totally out of the box piece of thinking and writing. It was atonal, but that wasn't the part that was interesting. It was about a woman who was completely amoral, a murderess, a whore, and she ultimately ends up in a rendezvous with Jack the Ripper. And we walked out, and Michael looked at me as we were going down the steps of the Met saying, if Alban Berg were alive, he'd probably do Carrie as a musical. And it was meant partly humorously, and the longer we thought about it, both of us went, and we ended up late into the night talking about it, and concluded that there might indeed be a very interesting idea here, partly because, as I said earlier, watching Piper and Sissy do their scenes, they were highly, highly theatrical and could be musicalized like rock opera almost. Plus, Michael had written all the songs for Fame. So the whole idea of the high school side of this made enormous sense. It was part of his vocabulary. And the more we thought about it, the more we liked it. We called Steve King, who went, if they can make a musical out of the dictator of Argentina, why not? And at that point, we called Dean Pitchford, who was Michael's collaborator on a couple of the songs for Fame, and he climbed aboard, and off we went. We ended up doing a workshop downtown at Michael Bennett's studio and invited all of Broadway to come and see the first act on its feet. And we ended up meeting with Mike Nichols. We ended up meeting with Bob Fosse. We ended up meeting with Jerome Robbins. And it was an incredibly heady, sort of great moment of opportunity. We opened for a month in Stratford-upon-Avon and sold out. We came to New York, ran 21 previews, 5 performances, and closed, having been largely clobbered by the New York Times, plus a number of other reviewers, although we got a couple of equal raves, like from Clyde Barnes at the Post. Bottom line, though, there was no money. The producer had run through it all and fled in the middle of the night, and we were done. And had the show, I think, been something that we liked, we probably would have licked our wounds and simply moved on. We moved on anyway, but the nagging belief was there was a great show here if only we could find it. So it took about 2 decades, and the 3 of us went back to work on it thinking that there were a lot of high schools, colleges, and regional theaters that would probably want to do Carrie, and that the kids could play kids in age for openers. But that we weren't satisfied with the writing, so we pulled it apart from top to bottom and rewrote 60-70% of the show. We did a reading, and we ended up doing another production down at MCC Theater, which ran 15 times as long as the original Broadway one did. And it was a piece that was very much to our liking. We've subsequently done more changes to it, but what happened as a result of the off-Broadway production was that Rodgers and Hammerstein licensed the piece. We released a cast album from it, which is like the #3 seller for the label that's done it off-Broadway. And it began being done in hundreds of high schools, colleges, and regional productions. It just closed a production that won all sorts of awards and sold out audiences in Los Angeles, and in London it won the best off-West End production. So it's had a really sort of like Carrie's Hand from the Grave. It's had a really happy ending and a real resurrection, which has been great. One of the really gratifying things about this experience was how much Steve King ended up loving the movie and acknowledging that it put him on the map. I think he would have been put on the map no matter what. Carrie was just a great little piece along the way together. But he, I think, thought that he thought the movie was an improvement on the novel, and it wasn't just him being polite. I think he genuinely thought that. I listened to him talk about the book, which as his sort of first published firstborn, he has a whole other brain when he looks at it today. I think it's a fantastic piece, and it's endured for 40 years plus because it touches so many people's experience, and it's become even more relevant in the time of bullying that we're living through, that it's had a resonance and a meaning that no one could have predicted 4 decades ago.